Plants, in one form or another, have existed for nearly 500 million years. The oldest living things on this planet are plants. The largest living things on this planet are plants. They cover the surface of every continent and conquer every ocean. Without them, no other life could survive. They provide us with the food we eat and the air we breathe. They purify the water we drink and produce the medicine that saves our lives. Without plants, the earth, as we know it, could not exist. You're listening to the Mind the Gap podcast, bridging the gap between your minds and everything else. I'm Keegan Gwydlin.
And I'm Mackie Drew.
And today our show is called Time to Nip This in the Bud.
So anyway, I want to talk about artificial selection today.
All right.
On top of all the plants.
So we should start off by defining what artificial selection is.
Yeah, I wanted to say, okay, so artificial selection is sort of like natural selection. You know, you've heard of that, evolution by means of natural selection. And that's when there's a selection pressure out in nature and organisms reproduce based on those selection pressures. And the ones that do well in those pressures tend to live longer and reproduce more. Now, the artificial selection is when humans pick traits that they like, and then they force those to be extended. So, like, it couldn't happen through many mechanisms. Just cloning one species you like. Say you have an apple that you really like. It tastes delicious. It's giant. It's got, it's not poisonous would be a great one too. And then, you like all those traits. So rather than, replanting it and maybe getting some pollination issues, you would graft it. You'd take off some of that and you'd spread that along. And that would not necessarily be any kind of genetic manipulation, but you'd be propagating those genetics in another way. So that would be.
So it's still genetic manipulation in a way, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just not your traditional reproduction and then death cycle. Yeah, so we deal with plants all the time, and they're helpful in many ways. We find, something tasty on the ground, and hooray, that's something we can eat now.
Yeah.
But we also influence them a lot. So, one I wanted to talk about was the grapefruit. It's really interesting because, it's got this interesting biological quirk. It's got, some drug interactions. So, like, when you have a drug interaction, you have drugs that affect how the other drugs you're taking work. Mm-hmm. So, with the grapefruit, we have over 85 recorded so far. So you could be taking, heart medication, and that can mess with that and have adverse effects. So, it works through two mechanisms. One that can be positive, it can actually intensify some medications. But it also has adverse effects with some medications where it actually blocks the metabolism of the drug by blocking drug metabolism enzymes in the small intestine. So it's interestingly biologically active. And, the grapefruit's actually a hybrid plant, and neither of the plants that it comes from have those interactions. So, the grapefruit's a mix between a sweet orange and a pomelo.
I've never heard of a pomelo.
Have you not?
No.
Well, it's a plant. It's like a bitter plant. Sort of tastes like a grapefruit, but a lot more mild rather. It's native to Southeast Asia. It's sort of like a green almost looks like a mix between an orange and a lime. It's a citrus fruit as well. So, and it tastes again like a grapefruit. So, the sweet orange and the pomelo probably mixed in the 18th century in the Barbados, but we don't know whether it was intentional or it was just a fluke. Those got near each other and they just, started making
that's very
fruit
weird.
Babies. Yeah.
And it seems like there's a lot more potential for cross-species breeding in plants than in animals.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, you see it so much more frequently. I don't know why that is. Do you know?
I'd be speculating. I mean, yeah, I'd have to do research into it before I said
Fair
anything.
enough. But yeah, no, it's you get some really interesting combinations. But yeah, the interestingly enough, I was looking into the whether or not the sweet orange or the pomelo have these drug interactions, and neither do. But the bitter orange does, one that they're not mixed with. So it's definitely the orange side that's having the drug interactions, just maybe like dormant genetics or
Yeah,
something to that
yeah,
effect.
or yeah, it could be like a recessive gene or something like that.
Yeah,
That's
it comes out with the mix. So that's interesting. Yeah. And so, yeah, the grapefruit's not been along very long, but it's sort of like a genetically modified, creation almost.
And
Um,
when did this happen? When was it?
in the 18th century. Yeah.
Oh
So you're
wow,
looking, 1700s.
that's still fairly recent though.
Or rather, not 1700s, 1900s. But yeah, no, that's very recent.
Hmm.
Yeah. So another one that's really big. This is one we know that we very heavily cultivated corn.
Right.
Initially, the corn had anywhere between 1 kernel and 10 kernels, but now
Slow down
they
there.
actually
10 whole kernels?
yeah, they were bigger though, so that's a plus.
Yeah.
So you could maybe eat it like a berry.
Enormous
But
popcorn.
oh man, I can't even imagine. Probably wouldn't work. But yeah, because of some hybridization. Wow, what a word. They actually have around 800 kernels now. So you can obviously see corn has a lot of little kernels all over it, and that's because we manipulated it. We were able to find different varieties that were better or were more preferable to us. I don't know why they wanted more kernels while being smaller. But it helps,
Yeah.
And it's interesting. The corn actually has a lot of resemblance to to multiple fruits. So like a pineapple, where they start out as a whole bunch of berries and then they combine to make one big fruit.
Right,
Except
right.
corn doesn't become one big fruit.
Yeah. It's like a raspberry as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, compared to the grape, corn's probably like a staple food, right? You're getting a
Yeah.
lot of it.
Yeah,
So, and we produce a ridiculous amount. When I say we, I mean the world.
Yeah.
Compared to with grapefruit, which we make 5 million tons of metric tons of grapefruit per year, there are over 800 million metric tons of corn produced per year.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, I can't stand grapefruit. I just
Yeah.
I wanna like it, but
Yeah,
just
me
no.
too. I tried so many times, and people say pour sugar on it, and I mean, like, well, is it a point
How
on
much
being a fruit?
sugar?
I poured sugar, I poured maple syrup, I poured bacon grease, and this is all in the same breakfast. It's still gross.
I have trouble believing that 5 million tons of grapefruit are consumed every year.
Oh, well, I'm sure most of them are thrown out after people realize how gross they are. Uh, but yeah, something that might help with that would be the miracle berries, which is a type of berry that's closely related to the shea plant. And it actually contains a chemical called miraculum, um, which is very creative on behalf of the scientists who discovered it. But it makes your sour taste buds not work. So you would taste a really delicious grapefruit instead, rather than it being so sour and bitter. They make everything sweeter. So things like vinegar start to taste like wine, lemon tastes like orange,
Wow.
and sour cream tastes like yogurt.
Oh
So,
man. Can you buy
yeah.
these anywhere?
Yeah, no, they're online. I don't think you can buy them like at the store, but yeah, you're actually not supposed to consume them. If you bite them, they're bitter, but like if you just roll them around your mouth for a little while, that effect can last for like an hour and a half.
I need to try this. Have you tried
Yeah.
this?
I have not tried it. I've heard about it for years, but I've never actually gotten to ordering them. I've seen people online try them and, they got really excited, and I've never actually just gotten around to it.
Man, that is awesome.
But yeah, more on artificial selection. Broccoli, cauliflower, kale, collard greens, Chinese broccoli, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts actually are all the same species.
Oh,
They
yeah.
they are all cultivars. Which, do you know what a cultivar is?
It's like basically they started with one plant and then they cultivated it in different ways and selected for different things, right?
Exactly. It's like a subspecies.
Mm-hmm.
Like a dog's breed.
Right.
But
right.
it's rather than it being it's very similar to a dog's breed, because it's not counted as a subspecies because the genetics are carefully controlled, and if they don't meet those specifics, then they're not considered a cultivar. And a cultivar is just for convenience sake. There's no actual like scientific use for doing it. It's just for people who are making it. They're like, okay, this is this variety and whatnot. So you can get all those vegetables from just that one little plant, and you can see that us working with their genetics.
That's the classic textbook example of artificial selection.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, probably people have heard of this in the past, but, it's worth mentioning.
Interestingly, a scientific, I guess, scientific analog to like breed of dog or cultivar of a plant is something we call an ecotype. And so that indicates a specific type of species. So there's I worked with plant genetics for a summer, and there were different ecotypes of the same species, and they were from a specific geographical area. It's almost like a cell line. So it's just a very specific, well-defined example of an organism.
It sounds like all these definitions are trying to do the same thing, actually.
Yeah.
I was trying to find the difference between a cultivar and a subspecies, and it's not really terribly well defined. That's the biggest difference I found was really who's using the term.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's all arbitrary, dividing walls and stuff. But
exactly,
anyway.
It's just for our convenience, really.
Yeah. Anyway, I'd like to kick it off with some plant trivia because I took a plant biology course last semester, and there was some really interesting stuff that I like talking about. So the first is probably the most popular thing when it comes to plants, and that's carnivorous plants. So this is the classic Venus flytrap thing, where the plants, instead of getting their nitrogen from the soil, these plants typically grow in nitrogen-poor areas like marshes, and so they have to get their nitrogen from a different source, and that source is insects.
I didn't realize that was the cause. So when they get this nitrogen from them, where are the animals getting the nitrogen from?
From whatever food they eat. All plants need nitrogen.
I see.
It's one of It's one of the main minerals. But this
seems like that cycle would end eventually, just if it's so nitrogen poor.
Yeah. But obviously insects are motile and plants are not. So insects can go to where the nitrogen is and bring it. Yeah. So it's a little bit misleading, the term carnivorous plants, because they're not actually carnivores in the sense that we think of it. They're actually insectivores. If you feed a carnivorous plant like a Venus flytrap meat, like beef, pork, chicken, stuff like that, it'll hurt the plant because the plant can't digest fats. So the fats will cause it some serious issues, and it'll have to kill that particular trap or whatever it is that it caught it in. So they're actually, they're actually insectivores. And there's a couple of major mechanisms that carnivorous plants use to capture prey. And, we don't typically think of plants as being particularly fast or sneaky or anything, but some of these are pretty cool. The first is pretty basic. It's called the flypaper mechanism or adhesive mechanism, and it's literally just a sticky surface that bugs land on, and then they are trapped there, and then digestive enzymes are secreted, and they dissolve the insect and resorb the nutrients. So this is stuff like the sundew. If you've seen pictures or anything like that, it's like a leaf with a bunch of, they look like spikes with little buds of dew at the end.
Yeah, that will be the thumbnail for this video for if you're on YouTube.
Oh, there we go. And when a fly lands on that, the dew on the end is sugary, so it attracts it. And it's also very sticky, so it gets stuck there. And then the plant will roll up that leaf and encase the bug, whatever it was, in a digestive enzyme and stuff like that. So that's the first one. The second is called a pitfall. This is a flycatcher plant, I think is the term, or something like that.
A flycatcher, like a Venus flytrap, or is this not that?
No, that's something different. It's so
Okay.
you form these things form a modified leaf. It's basically like a leaf, and it's rolled up, and sometimes it has like a little cover on top. But basically, there's a pool of digestive enzymes and water in the leaf in the pot, and so a fly will slip in. They'll like fall into the pot and not be able to get out because there's all these like downward pointing hairs, and there may be a cover on the trap and stuff like that.
Okay.
And then they'll just get dissolved in that pool.
All right. Well, these. Do you think it's worth it? I guess it has to be worth it for these plants. It just seems like a lot of work.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
well,
Like plants normally don't expend this much energy doing things.
it's true. They're mostly passive traps, and they don't really have to go hunting, right? But the thing is, they are usually smaller, and they need that nitrogen to survive. So in a nitrogen-poor environment, they will do better than anyone else.
I guess so.
Another interesting type is a lobster pot trap. And with these, basically, the prey will fly in or wander into the trap, and they will get lost. It's basically a maze inside this modified leaf, and they won't be able to find their way out.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I've never seen that.
Oh yeah, that's some of these are less well known. Another similar one is a pigeon trap. So it's similar to the lobster pot, but with the lobster pot trap, if the fly or whatever manages to find their way out, they're home free. But with a pigeon trap, once they're in, the plants have like thorns or spikes or hairs or something like that will cover the entrance, and it will physically prevent the prey from leaving the trap. So once you're in a pigeon trap, you're done. Beyond that, there's the snap trap, which is the Venus flytrap. Typically, it's 2 leaves or 1 leaf sometimes, and when you've got trigger hairs on the Venus flytrap, and when you hit 2 of the trigger hairs within a certain time limit, it'll snap the trap shut and again digest the insect.
That's really cool that they can time it.
Oh yeah.
Like how does that even work?
Well, and it's
like...
so weird triggering movement because plants don't have nerve cells.
Yeah, I guess it must be some sort of mechanical thing? I can't even imagine how that works.
It's ionic mostly, so it'll initiate. Okay. It's similar to the way that nerve cells work with
neurotransmitters.
No, not with neurotransmitters. With cascades of ions. So in a typical nerve, you get nerve transmissions are conducted by the flow of potassium and sodium ions. And it'll do a similar thing in plants. So the plant cells will all, have an influx of a certain ion. And
okay, so they do kind of have a nervous system.
But they don't have dedicated nerve cells.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. Good distinction. Anyway.
And the last one, and by far the coolest one, is a suction trap. And basically you see these underwater, and they have little pods that the plant will pump water out of. And so it creates a suction inside the pod, and the pod has a trapdoor with a trigger. And when an animal comes by and trips the trigger hair, then the pod door will snap open, suck a whole bunch of water in, the insect along with it, and then snap shut again.
Wow, so I guess they're just like primarily or exclusively underwater then?
Yeah.
Okay,
I don't think
cool.
we've seen them anywhere except underwater, but that one is like by far the fastest. Like a Venus flytrap, it takes a little while to close.
Yeah.
It takes like a solid full second to close. These
things create enough suction to pull that in, they need to be quite quick.
Yeah, and it's fractions of a second for the suction trap. People have trouble capturing it on high-speed camera. It's like...
Wow.
Yeah, it's like one frame, the animal is outside the pod, and the next frame it's inside the pod. And they don't even see the trap trigger. So it's really shockingly fast. So that's carnivorous plants. But the other, I guess, interesting thing is defense mechanisms that plants have. Because they have a problem
that's unique to plants and, some fungi. And that is that they can't run away or fight the way, an animal could. So they use special defense mechanisms to protect themselves against being eaten, since they are, the basis for the entire food chain. There's two types.
They are the most preyed on things.
Yes, exactly. So there's two types of defense mechanisms. There's either constitutive, which are always present, or induced, which are produced in response to injury or being eaten or something like that. The constitutive mechanisms are often chemical, and the chemicals are known as secondary metabolites. And a secondary metabolite is a compound which is produced, but it's not used in your standard metabolic reaction. So it's not used to, produce energy. It's not used to transport any hormone signals or anything like that. It's just sort of an extra thing you produce on the side. But these compounds are often toxic and bitter, and they, an animal will eat a plant and they'll taste this toxic and bitter thing, and then they'll never eat that again.
See, now that's something I never got. Is it that they're trying to train the species, or is it that they're trying to train those individuals? Do you think it works both ways?
Yeah, probably works both ways. For one thing, there is learning in mammals at least. So a mother will probably teach offspring to not eat this plant and to eat this plant. Sometimes it's biological. Coevolution takes a lot longer than learning, though. So the secondary metabolites are actually things that we're quite familiar with. They include things like nicotine, caffeine, morphine, colchicine, quinine, digitalis, tannins, and cannabinoids. All the things that we tend to use as, drugs or things that are active in our bodies are things that these plants produce in order to deter things from eating them.
That makes sense, like why would they produce it if not to affect us and things like us? So, they produce, say, enough caffeine to kill an insect, and it just does something great for us.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Nicotine is one of the big poisons that was very specifically co-evolved, and when certain insects feed on tobacco plants, totally kills them with the nicotine. But these chemical
and it does
defenses,
it to us, too, if you didn't notice.
Yes, that's true. Chemical defenses can also be physical in a sense. For example, monarch larvae are often laid on milkweed plants, and they will feed on the milkweed. However, milkweed produces latex in certain veins of its leaves, and when the larvae is eating the plant and chews through the veins, the latex is released, and it traps and encases the larvae and kills about 30% of monarch larvae by just physically encasing them in a latex shell. But interestingly, some monarchs have evolved in turn to cut the latex veins at the base of the leaf so that they can, continue feeding unharmed.
That's what I love about evolution. Sometimes you can see it happening almost like there's some sort of intent, and that there's two big players, milkweed, I'm going to get you. And,
yeah,
the
exactly.
monarch. But, it's just over generations that this is happening, and it always looks like it's intentional, and it's always more fun to think of it like that way. But that's really not what's going on, right?
Yeah. This is the case with a lot of plant things. For example, there's mechanical defenses as well, and that's stuff like thorns on the stem, wax on leaves, or silica embedded in leaves. Like grass has sharp edges, you may have noticed. That's because there's crystals of silica that are deposited at the edges of the blades of grass.
Is that when you rub grass the wrong way and it's sharp kind of?
That's right.
That's it. Okay, cool.
And those sharp edges cause cuts and abrasion in the gastrointestinal tract of large herbivores, and they actually erode the mouth parts of insects as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so very effective defense mechanisms. So those are the constitutive, always expressed defense mechanisms. There are some induced as well, though. And probably the most interesting one is that when plants are injured sometimes, they'll release a chemical signal, and that chemical signal will be detected by a predatory insect, and the predatory insect will come and eat the insect that's eating the plant.
That is extremely intelligent.
Yeah, so it's like a signal for help. It's almost like, ring the triangle when dinner is ready. It's calling plants or calling insects to the plant in order to help it out and, feed it. So
I've never
really
heard of that.
Interesting stuff.
It's
And
really cool.
yeah, and the last one is called thigmonasty, which is a method of movement. And you see this in the famous mimosa plant. And when you touch the leaf of the plant, it'll actually fold up and withdraw from the touch. So that's an induced mechanism of defense. And so
now I got a
pretty
question.
cool.
There's this plant in my backyard. Whenever it's like springtime, I touch the buds and it explodes. Is that? Like I touch the seed pods and it just explodes.
Yeah, that's a mechanism for dispersal. So it's
makes sense. Okay.
If you're an animal and you come by and you brush against it, then it knows it quote unquote knows that you're moving and it disperses pollen on you and then you carry it away. So, not the same thing,
All
but
right.
still cool. Let's see, what else we got? Oh, yes. Lastly, there's a, plant trivia, nothing to do with defense mechanisms, but there's a microalgae called D. salina, and it's a plant which is a halophile. It's salt-loving. And it's interesting because it produces beta-carotene in high concentrations, which is the same compound that gives carrots their red color. And it protects against intense light, and it produces glycerol to prevent osmotic damage. So this makes it interesting because it's used in, cosmetics and all this stuff. And it can also turn water red or orange. There's a myth floating around that it also turns lakes pink, but it's not actually the responsible microbe. That's the work of an archaean called halobacteria.
Oh, why would they call it halobacteria?
Ha 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 ha. Halo means salt-loving. Ha.
Well, anyway, there's the snow algae that turns snow pink, though. So there's that.
I haven't heard of that one. What's that?
Oh, yeah, it smells like watermelon. Nobody knew where all that watermelon juice was coming from, and then it turned out that it was actually, it causes like explosive diarrhea too, if you eat it, that is.
Lovely.
Yeah. So, we were talking about earlier how all these plants have we've tailored them to our needs, but there's a lot of things that they do that we didn't intend them to do, but we just sort of found, or we were able to find them because they did them already. Like, for instance, oxygen and energy. We have all this oxygen in our atmosphere only because of plants. Before plants came around, we didn't have that much oxygen in our atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And it's really the only reason that we can exist now, to mess with all these plants and eat them, right? And why all these animals exist, to eat the plants. Their oxygen is like, rocket fuel for organisms. Mm-hmm. You can suddenly make all this energy that you couldn't before, because you can use aerobic respiration, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think that, okay, well, plants, they take in carbon dioxide and they put oxygen, and they do, but they also take in oxygen.
Of course, plants
a lot
use
of people
aerobic respiration as well.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people just assume it's a one-way street, right? We use oxygen and put a carbon dioxide, and they do the opposite, and it's perfect harmony. But there's a reason they're doing this. They need the aerobic respiration as well.
Yeah, so they're doing it for themselves.
Exactly, but they're more important than that still. All the energy that biological systems can use comes from the sun. And the only way we can get that energy is through these plants. We have to, everything eats plants. Everything eats these producers of energy. They turn carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into oxygen and carbohydrates like sugars and stuff for consumption, and then they also give us the oxygen in the meantime. So we really depend on them a lot for these kind of things, things that are very basic to life. And more recently, and by that I mean like in the last few thousand years, we found more uses for them, like drugs. You know, the willow bark has been used for the aspirin that's in it, rather.
Yep, classic.
You know, everybody talks about how that's where the aspirin comes from. It comes from the bark of a tree, right?
Yep.
Not really. It's actually the bark contains salicylic acid. You know, it's the same stuff you put on your face to treat acne. And it was consumed as a painkiller, just like the acetylsalicylic acid is.
Yeah.
The aspirin. But it caused the stomach to bleed a lot, so we actually decided that we'd fix it. You know, we'd make it better, just like we tend to do, you know, with a lot of nature's products.
Mm-hmm.
We concentrate them, we make them consistent, and we fix some of the problems they didn't have. So we added this acetyl group to the salicylic acid, and then suddenly we have this really useful drug that, you know, has very few side effects, but it can be used for things like a blood thinner to prevent heart attack and stroke. It can treat pain, headaches.
And it's
prevents
a lot more,
colorectal cancer.
And it's a lot more stable as well. It doesn't degrade as quickly.
Oh, see, and I didn't even know that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that would make sense. Okay, yeah. And you took an aspirin right before we started the podcast too. So.
It was an ibuprofen, actually.
Ah, traitor.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, but yeah, you know, like that's not it. Like we've got lists and lists of drugs that we found from plants. You know,
Of course.
We've derived something. We found that they had some sort of biological effectiveness, and then we extracted them. We figured out how it works, and we've
Actually,
exploited it ever since.
I have a little bit of a stat, if I can remember it.
Sure.
It's I think it's 2/3 of all drugs on the market are plant derived compounds.
That's quite extensive. See, I saw quite a few lists that I was like, well, I'm going to go get a list of all the plants that we get from drugs. And I was like, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah, no.
Huge numbers, right? One thing we found a while back was quinine. You mentioned it earlier in the things that plants produce to
quinine.
help prevent... Yeah, quinine, right. And we find that in plants, and it's actually the main tasty ingredient in tonic water. And I say tasty sarcastically there.
Yeah.
Some people enjoy
water
tonic
is
water.
awful.
I don't enjoy it, but it was produced to treat malaria.
Yep.
Of course, gin was mixed in because that's what they did back in the day. So it actually prevents the getting malaria. And it doesn't actually, once you've got malaria, it doesn't help treat it unless you use it intravenously or rectally. Quinine, that is. So it's
tonic water.
It's
gin and tonics intravenously.
Sounds like a plan. So yeah, it's not a be all end all, but it's sure helpful. It's no longer recommended if you have the proper drugs for malaria to drink tonic water and gin. But tonic water.
People do it anyway. God damn it!
It can still be used to treat leg cramps.
Oh, that's
interesting. And interestingly enough, if you put it under a black light and under ultraviolet light, it glows like really bright.
What?
Yeah, really
cool,
right?
I have to try that. I have to try that.
I don't have a black light. Do you have tonic water? Do you have a black light?
I have a black light.
I'll grab some tonic water. We'll see what we can do.
Excellent.
All right. But yeah, a lot of people don't like drugs, right? They're like, well, I don't want to take that medication, even though they're probably from plants in the first place. It's not natural, you know?
Yeah.
So they go for herbal remedies. They go to their herbalist or whatever.
Oy.
But you got to be careful with that because, they can be biologically active and they may not be stable, but you also might be getting ripped off. So if you think something's going to work for you, you shouldn't go to your herbalist. You shouldn't go to the herbal section of the drugstore. Just go to your doctor and ask them for something, Ask them if that's okay if you take it, if it's effective, if you're not wasting your money. You don't want to self-medicate any time you think that it might be serious.
Yeah. The other issue is that with herbal remedies, they don't track, purity or concentration. So you could be overdosing on, impure versions of some of these drugs and biological.
Yeah, we don't know the side effects in a lot of these cases too.
Yeah.
Like St. John's wort. It's definitely effective in treating depression, but we don't know to what chemicals in it cause it.
Yeah.
And people still take it, even though there's no control for concentrations. We couldn't control for that because we don't know what's effective in it, right? So, you can take St. John's wort, but at your own risk. I wouldn't risk it.
Yeah. Well, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I wanted to talk a little bit about purification.
Oh.
People always talk about plants in a positive light because they're healthy and effective at things. But they actually have some really good real life uses for some serious problems like radiation and heavy metals. You can some plants, including especially cabbage, soak up radiation and heavy metals like nothing. They pull all of it up, and they can actually be used to clear an area of radiation or heavy metals. So, like, if you have a lot of pollution in that area, or it's just, minor amounts, obviously enough so that it can still grow, you could use that as a tool. But it's not usually used as that. It's usually used, you plant a field of cabbage, and then you take it back and you test how much heavy metals and how much radiation is in the soil. To see how bad it's gotten.
Yeah. That's too bad.
Yeah, I know. But you see, the thing is,
it would be cool if you could just soak up all the radiation into like one cabbage and then throw it away.
Yeah, exactly. I wish and that's another good point. You shouldn't eat them.
Yeah.
Like, you can grow cabbage here. It's not getting rid of the radiation. It's soaking it up. It's like a sponge. You're not going to get rid of anything. You throw that cabbage somewhere safe,
Yeah.
Don't throw
into
it
a fire or something.
No, don't throw it in a fire. That's the worst thing you could do. What's wrong with you? Now, this is something cool. This is recent news. There's Danish scientists, and they've genetically engineered a crop of cress that can detect landmines.
What?
Yeah, I know. I was like, how is that even possible? But yeah, they realized there was a serious issue with landmines in the world. There's over 100 million unexploded landmines planted.
Wow.
And there's over 26,000 people dying per year from unexploded landmines.
What?
Of course, yeah. So you got a serious problem there. So ERSA, I think it's called ERSA Biodetection Company is a Danish company, and they've developed this crop that if there's a landmine nearby, then it'll turn red instead of green. So you can spray these seeds all over a field, and they'll grow. And the ones that are red, there's probably a landmine nearby.
And cress is like a weed, right? It grows anywhere.
It'll grow anywhere, exactly. That's why they use it, right?
Yeah.
So it's detecting NO2 levels from the evaporating explosives that are in landmines. And it's not... They do warn a lot about the use of this, because some landmines are sealed. They don't allow for the evaporation outside of the landmine, so it's not used to clear an area, but it's a good way to get a good detection method. Because right now it's basically manual. You go out and you test the ground
with a stick in front of you,
with heavy metal or heavy metal objects, or a stick, literally, in some places.
Yeah.
So this is a lot safer way to at least get an indication. But to say for an area there are no landmines here, it's very hard to do.
Yeah.
You can't, because, it's hard to prove that there's nothing there. You can probably prove that there's something there, but it's hard to prove that there's definitely no landmines.
Yeah.
So,
it's a good case with everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good tool, but it's not a be-all, end-all. But I thought that was really cool that they could do that.
Yeah, it is cool.
But yeah, speaking of GM crops.
Yes, I have a whole bunch on GM crops, and I was just in a Facebook battle yesterday over GM crops.
Always the funnest.
Yes, of course. So, as we discussed, plants are not what they once were. Humans have changed them through genetic modification. And artificial selection, like we were talking about earlier, is a form of genetic modification. And that's all that GM means. GM crops is genetically modified crops. So we've been genetically modifying plants ever since we started interacting with them and selecting them. So we talked about artificial selection. That is a form of genetic modification, but usually GM refers to stuff that we do in a lab. It's like using modern biotechnology techniques and, splicing genes from foreign species into new species in order to somehow benefit the crop. So this is often used to make a crop, more hardy, more tasty, larger, affect its ripening, whether it's making it earlier or later or anything like that. You can also use it to, you can also make it resistant to pests or insecticides. And that's the case with Roundup. The famous Monsanto thing, they created a crop that was resistant to a herbicide that they themselves were marketing. So the idea is you plant these Roundup-proof GM crops, And then you can spray Roundup over the whole field, and it'll kill everything except the crops.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And it works really well.
But Keegan, I've got a rebuttal.
Yes.
Frankenfood. Carry on.
Okay.
You want to address that?
This is part of the all-natural fallacy, I think. Yeah. I don't think I've quite heard the argument Frankenfood before.
Oh, no? Okay. It's a term people throw around to say, oh, it's combinations of different foods, therefore it's bad. I don't know how that follows, but...
Sounds like an all-natural fallacy.
Yeah,
but anyway.
For sure.
So the first commercially available GM crop was the Flavor Saver tomato. And this was engineered to inhibit a certain enzyme, which normally degrades cell components and makes a mushy tomato and makes it susceptible to fungal infection. It's an alternative to the standard, in which, at the time, tomatoes were picked green and then artificially ripened. Later on when they got to the store or closer to it. This increased the shelf life, but didn't help with the softening. So, it didn't work exactly as they wanted. They wanted the Flavor Saver to resist turning all mushy, and it didn't really help with that, but it did help with the ripening issues.
Yeah, no, that sounds like it would help. I mean, at least you're not, keeping it all ripe all the time. I mean, at least extend the shelf life, which is kind of like helping the mushiness issue.
Yeah. And people paint GM crops with such a bad brush all the time, but they can often improve health. The example is golden rice. And this is a strain of rice that was genetically engineered to produce beta-carotene, which we talked about earlier. And that's a vitamin A precursor. And by growing this, you can combat vitamin A deficiency in food-poor areas, especially since vitamin A deficiency kills 670,000 children under 5 per year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and the thing about making golden rice specifically is that these food-poor areas, they have their staple food is rice, right? They can grow rice. That's maybe all they can grow, and suddenly now they've got this extra vitamin in there, and that's helping them not die so much. So
yeah.
That's great.
And it's, there's nothing wrong with it except for some people feel sketchy about it.
Yeah, there's no evidence to suggest, or even viable mechanism to suggest that it may be bad for your health.
Yeah. Another really important use of genetically modified crops is as biofuels. So even all over the world, there's research going on to make GM crops that will be susceptible to degradation to enable the easier production of bioethanol as a fuel source. And this is, as an alternative to fossil fuels and stuff like that. So again, we're advancing a lot of technological fronts, just using these same techniques and engineering crops to suit our needs. Probably the most controversial of all the genetically modified crops is the fish tomato. And this is a genetically engineered tomato with a gene from the winter flounder, which is a fish with an antifreeze gene. And the idea was that it would fight frost by using this protein.
So you'd be able to grow these tomatoes in places that normally be able to grow them, like colder climates.
It would help against a frost snap, So
yeah, okay.
If there's a frost earlier in the season than you're expecting, it could wipe out a whole field. But this would help prevent something like that.
This is kind of a random offshoot, but I always imagined that tomatoes were grown vertically. I never imagined them in a field.
Well, hydroponic tomatoes are grown vertically.
That's fair. Okay, well, that must be it.
Yeah. But
anyway.
that was the most controversial GM crop.
And just to note, that never hit the shelves.
Yes, that's
the fish
true.
tomato.
Yeah.
There were some problems with it, wasn't there? It was not.
It didn't work very
stable.
well.
Yeah.
Basically.
Okay. So they didn't get the expected results.
Yeah.
That they
exactly.
wanted. Yeah. So they never put it on the shelf. Interestingly enough, though, I've heard several people tell me that they can't eat certain tomatoes because they're allergic to fish. And they come to me and they're like, "Yeah, I can't eat the ones that are non-organic." And I'm like, so I looked into it. I didn't want to snap on it, but
Yeah.
and it never hit the shelves. So that they're wrong. They're just, I guess, placeboing themselves into thinking that they're allergic to these tomatoes. Maybe
Something
they're
like
just
that.
allergic to tomatoes.
Yeah, it's there's never been any evidence to suggest that genetically modified crops are anything but just as safe as other crops.
I've heard arguments against environmental issues. Is that something to be worried about?
Like what?
Like, wheat gets out and it's really powerful, so it takes out a forest, for instance.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever happened.
No, it hasn't.
So, I mean, you can speculate about this stuff, but it's usually pretty tightly controlled as well.
For sure, yeah. Like, yeah, and a lot of these big companies that are doing the genetic modification, they make it's still bad business practice, but it's nothing bad for the health of people or the environment. They make the regulations more difficult because they're big companies and they can afford harder regulations, but they don't want smaller competitors to come up and
Yep, and
be
the
able
other
to
thing
get
is
through these hoops.
the other thing is that people are like, oh, the crop will spread and get out, but a lot of companies put kill genes in their crops that the seeds will be sterile, so that the farmers have to buy new seeds every year. So it's
Yeah. Again, that's a questionable business practice, but it says nothing about the health or medical.
Well, it in fact it prevents the unauthorized or unintended spread of the GM crop, right?
Exactly. You're going to get a different crop every year. And, this has been happening for hundreds of years because crops tend to be very heterozygous, which means that they change every reproductive
Every generation.
cycle. Yeah, exactly. They're very different from the last one. The same thing happens with apples.
Yeah.
With a lot of grains, this happens too. And farmers have been buying from suppliers for a long time because they can get these same crops and they go to make sure this has happened. Before there was genetic modification, this was going on. So it's not to say that this is some new thing that's like the spawn of genetic modification. It's just a helpful failsafe. But yeah, are you done with genetic modified crops? Or?
Yeah, I think I've covered all the big stuff. I guess the thing that I like to emphasize is that it's totally safe. You can question business practices, but the science is sound.
Fair enough. And those are different subjects and for different people to discuss. But yeah, what I want to talk about is the man-eating plant myths. So I've heard some great stories about, explorers coming across a plant that's eating a corpse, or they find the skeletal remains in these carnivorous plants.
Yep.
Classic. So I looked into some of these myths, and a lot of the myths are invented. So I know that sounds weird, but like they'll literally just be a tale in a book, and somebody will take it seriously. For instance, what I've come across is 2 stories of trees that were legitimately, like, seriously, taken. So these are not the ones that were like misinterpreted as real. These were ones that people were suggesting were real all along. So yeah, the first one I've got is the Yativio, which means I see you, in J.W. Buell's Land and Sea from 1887, which is it's like a medical, or not a medical, but a biology textbook.
Okay.
It's sort of a guide to different like creatures and plants from around the world.
All right.
It talks about a lot of monsters, sea monsters, and Bigfoots and all that jazz. So it's intended to be taken seriously, but it isn't, good. It talks about a tree that's got like a big thick trunk, and on top it's like a Medusa. So all these like vines like waving around and flailing and trying to grab things that come near it. So
it's like the Whomping Willow.
Exactly, except way more active. Like they're like snakes on the ends,
Wow.
They're looking for their next meal. What's interesting? It doesn't talk about how it's supposed to eat them. Just, I guess, it grabs them and then it eats them. But regardless, no evidence for that. That is just total bunk. Just the guy made it up.
Yeah.
Now, corpse flowers are more infamous for this sort of thing. There's several different types of corpse flowers, but a lot of times when they're first discovered, if they're big enough, people assume that they're eating something, like that you're eating a person, because they actually smell like a rotting corpse, like specifically a rotting human corpse.
Lovely.
Yeah, which is a distinct smell. So that's why they may think that this is eating people, right? So some of these plants are so big that you could actually imagine eating a small person, right? But the thing is that it's not actually a carnivorous plant at all. These corpse flowers, which are often considered man-eating, aren't carnivorous. They don't eat flies. They don't eat bugs. They just smell to get flies to do their pollination.
Makes sense.
So, a bee might go from flower to flower, not specifically going to the right flower. These corpse flowers have a very specific set. So, they're using these flesh-eating flies to move from exactly their plant to another one of their plants. So these corpse flowers have kind of created a new niche for pollination. And I looked into whether you could even put an infant into a carnivorous plant and it would eat it. But you couldn't. I checked everything. The biggest ones could maybe eat a rat. And that do sometimes eat rats, but again, they die because of it. So, that's the biggest thing you could put in there. So there's no evidence that there's a man-eating plant. I wish there was, though.
It would be cool.
There's another hazard, but it'd be cool to see.
Yeah.
It could have been used as a method of extermination, or not extermination, but what is it?
Execution.
Capital punishment, execution. Yeah. In the past, and that'd be fun to think about. But anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's all I got on man-eating plants. So you want to switch and head into the game section?
Yeah, sure.
All right, welcome to the game section. Keegan, if you were designing a zombie defense mechanism for your house out of plants, what would you do? What features would you include in this one plant?
Okay. So it's got to be one plant?
Yes, one
one species? All right. So I'd want it to have, obviously I'd want it to be fairly tall to prevent climbing and stuff like that. Probably a smooth trunk, so maybe strong woody trunk, and I could plant a whole bunch of them in a row, and then maybe at the top
so
with
a barrier method.
Yeah, barrier method, but I'd also put thorns and stuff on the trunks and stuff like that, and then maybe some some form of, if I could make a man-eating trap thing, that would be cool. Maybe
Yes,
maybe a pot of digestive enzyme stuff like some of those carnivorous plants have.
Okay, yeah, I think that's probably a good way to go. I'm thinking sort of maybe a little bit different than you. I'm thinking a gun tree. So it uses the iron in the soil. I don't know. Okay, how about this? Big woody trunk. It sort of digs down to make almost a moat.
Okay.
And then on the front of the tree, it'll have digestive enzymes. So there's a barrier, and then underneath there'd be a big pool of zombie, eventually.
Yummy.
But it could digest fat, because zombies can have fat on them.
Right, of course.
All right. So anyway.
I like it. Let's get on though.
Yeah.
We got to make those.
Are you not doing this?
Oh, okay. All right, and now I think it's time for our 5-minute challenge. So when the 5-minute challenge, one of us challenges the other to learn as much about a topic in 5 minutes as possible, and then we discuss it on the next episode. So last time, I challenged Mackie to learn as much as possible about glottochronology. So what have you got for us?
Okay, so I assumed by your background that this was going to be a biology-related thing. This was not. It was a language-related thing.
Indeed it was.
What I've got for glottochronology is, I got some notes here. So it's first off, it's a method of studying the temporal relationship between languages. So, when certain languages diverge, I'm assuming.
Yep.
The Swadesh method is the most well-known method.
Uh-huh.
And it works by comparing certain key words in languages, like certain things that most languages would have. Here's just a few. I, you, this, who, what, 1, 2, fish, dog, louse, blood, bone, egg, horn, tail, ear, eye, nose, tooth. You get it.
Yeah.
Things that, you have to refer to all the time.
Yeah.
But some people say that there's no predictive value in this field. So, it can be used to maybe discuss what's going on in the past, but it doesn't actually really tell us anything about what's going to happen in language in the future. There's a lot of criticism towards this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I could get because it was a lot of content and I didn't know where to go.
Yeah, it's hard when you're not in straight hard science and there's no
exactly
definite answers. But glottochronology is based on two fundamental assumptions. The first is that a stable basic vocabulary exists in all languages, and that it's basically the same thing, and that replacements happen in a similar fashion to radioactive decay. So there's a predictable frequency of when a word will get changed from its stable vocabulary.
Makes sense.
Right. So the idea states that, and it's called the Swadesh list, was those words like I, you, we, this, that, blah, 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 all those.
Yeah.
And the idea is that those vocabulary, those words are replaced at a constant rate across all languages and can be therefore used to measure the passage of time. So if I was comparing two languages, I would take the percentage of words with a common origin in the two languages, like that look similar, and that would be a measure of how recently the languages diverged from each other.
I see. So it's kind of like radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, basically. And so just like in carbon dating, you have a chronologic constant, which is a constant rate of word replacement, which would be the half-life in a radioactive issue. So, there are some issues with it, like you said. Some of the more important ones are that the rate of change may not be the same in all cultures.
Yeah, and see, that's crazy to me because, I can only imagine that the rate of change has increased with the flow of information that we've got going on now. And
that's the other thing. Social and historical events may alter language in large leaps at a time.
Yeah.
So...
And I noticed there's one word on this list that I kind of I take exception to of it being there. The word year. Because I recall there is a tribe that doesn't have any kind of understanding of time.
Really?
Yeah, they have no words to describe passage of time. Present, past, future, minute, hour.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so they just don't care. Apparently it's very chill.
I think that's an exception, because at most...
Yeah.
And even, like the talking elephant, or talking
elephant?
Talking gorilla, Coco. She knows the concepts of, yesterday, tomorrow, in the past, in the future, blah, 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 stuff like that. So, I think that it's fairly common to have passage of time. Maybe that's a special exception, though.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. No, there's... It makes so much sense to keep track of time. I can't imagine why they hadn't come up with it or didn't want it. Okay, so that's cool. Glottochronology. Yeah. I get to challenge you now, though.
Yes.
So I'm going to challenge you to the least offensive term for this thing, and it's tiny towns.
Okay.
Tiny towns.
Tiny towns. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So look that up. It'll be probably clear enough.
Okay.
All right, so I've got a quiz for you.
Yes, I'm so excited.
All right, so I've got a quiz, and I've labeled it Ferns or Fantasy. So I'm going to tell you a word.
Okay.
And it's either the name of a plant, a common name of a plant, or it's the name of a fantasy town. So like a city, a town, a village in a fantasy genre. It could be a video game, it could be a movie, a TV show.
Oh, geez. All right.
So some of these are pretty funny. I think that they're really on the edge. Everybody I've given this to has failed miserably. So I'm going to start with the easiest one. Duskull.
Town.
Is Duskull a fern or fantasy?
Fantasy.
You're saying it's fantasy. No, it's not. This is sold in the grocery store. It is a berry.
Oh my God.
It's black nightshade. And some of the strains can be eaten, some of them can't be. It's cultivated in North America and Africa.
Wow.
So, well, okay, this one's I think is pretty good. Arrowwood.
Oh.
Exactly. You got a little for the fantasy, you got a little for the plant.
Okay.
Arrowwood.
I'll say fern.
You're gonna say fern. You're right. It's a flowering dogwood on the east coast of North America.
All right.
All right. Okay. So minus Anor.
That's got to be a fantasy.
Yep, you're right. It is a city in Lord of the Rings.
I knew it.
All right. Okay. You're lucky you got that one. You'd have a lot of people upset with you.
It's probably
All right.
true.
So, what about a Zola?
Fantasy.
Fantasy? No, it's a water fern in
Ah.
southern Ontario to Texas, all along that area.
Wow.
Yeah. Pretty big for you not to know about it. Wow. All right. How about this one? Such. Sutch.
Fantasy.
Fantasy? You're right.
Yeah.
It is a major city in Elder Scrolls Oblivion that you cannot visit.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, actually. I was
okay.
mostly guessing.
Good stuff. I figured this would be mostly guessing, but it's kind of fun to see
Yeah.
how similar they can be. All right. So Woodbine.
Oh. I'm gonna say fern because there is a place, Woodbine Casino, right? And racetrack? So that's got to be named after a real thing.
You're right.
Yes.
Drat your knowledge of things. All right. Yeah, it's an aggressive vine native to the United States. It's also called the love vine.
Huh. Okay.
All right. So how about Weymouth?
Spell it?
Waymoot.
Oh, man. Fantasy.
Fantasy, you're right.
All right.
Lord of the Rings. It's
See,
a town in Lord of the Rings.
I didn't know that it was a town in Lord of the Rings.
Yes, so you shouldn't know. This is a simple guessing game. True
All
or
right.
false, essentially. All right, so how about Riverwood?
Fern.
I was hoping you'd get this because now I'm mad at you. This is actually the first town you visited in Skyrim.
I've not played Skyrim.
Oh, well, that's your loss. Well, all right. How about Morel? Morel.
Fern.
Yes, it's actually Black Nightshade again. Number 1 coming back for number 9.
Fool me once,
So-
shame on you.
All right, this is the last one. Paloom. Paloom.
That sounds a lot like a fantasy.
Yes, it's a town in Final Fantasy II.
Yeah.
All right, I didn't keep track of your score, but you seem to do all right.
Well, thank you. That was a fun quiz.
No problem. I enjoyed it. Okay, so I guess that's everything. I guess email any comments or questions you have to mindthegaphosts@gmail.com. The next show will be called Catch Some Zeds. You should subscribe to us on YouTube, iTunes, or the podcast feed of your choice, and also be sure to rate or like us depending on your platform. Thanks for listening.
Lily is lovely, blossoms a tree. Of all the sweethearts I've yet to meet, well, I finally chose an American Beauty rose.